Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I am Annie Kuo. In an effort to navigate the challenging dynamics of the U.S. China relationship, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen undertook a recent visit to China. The purpose of her visit was to foster economic consensus and establish effective channels of communication between the world's two largest economies. Will her diplomatic mission yield any transformative effects on the already perilous balance between the two nations? Joining us today are Lai I-Chung, president of the Prospect Foundation, former Taiwan diplomat in both Japan and the U.S., expert in Taiwan-U.S. Japan-China relations. Joining us, Chenlung Kuo, United Daily News Deputy Editor-in-Chief, and Alexander Huang, KMT International Affairs Director and U.S. Representative. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, first of all, we're talking about Yellen's trip to Beijing, of course, and after when she came back, she said that the whole trip was productive and successful. So, Preston, I would like to first ask you, what is your overall perspective of Yellen's trip to Beijing this time? Do you think it really has built a positive impact on the two nations?
Well, according to Yellen, she said that it's constructive. So that we just take it as since she said so. But the overall issue is about how the U.S.-China relationship will go. And it seems that the Yellen, on her visit, well, I do not think that she's able to arrest the current trend of the competition and probably worsening dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship. But she did raise some hope about China's willing to talk, at least in the meeting, and especially in terms of the economic front that China wanted it. And of course, people talk about how before the Yellen's visit, Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken also visited China and saw Xi Jinping. But Yellen this time wasn't able to meet with Xi Jinping. Of course, that does not mean that Yellen was being slighted by China or not. But the issue is that while the U.S.-China, in terms of the meeting itself, the communication itself, that United States wanted to have the military talk, but China only allowed the economic side of the conversations. And the United States demand that for the economic side of the conversation to exist, the political security leg represented by the Secretary of State Antony Blinken, that needs to exist before and any other thing that can go forward. So that's how the sequence of things that we witness. So the issue about the U.S.-China, I think in terms of economic relationship, probably more talk. We're going to see that is going to be there, but the competition as well as the kind of military confrontations, I think that trend will also continue as well.
Thank you. And Chenlung, what do you think? I think Preston also talked earlier that this time Yellen was not received by Xi. So do you think this was expected?
It was said before she departed for Beijing and said she's not going to meet with Xi Jinping. But in general, I think the atmosphere is cordial and positive. I mean, she even met with some of the old colleagues of China who had retired, like Liu He and Zhou Xiaochuan. That seemed to be unprecedented. I mean, in this kind of dealing with foreign officials, the retired officials usually don't come out. So that means China wants to continue the economic exchange between U.S. and China to have it momentum to go on. Because Yellen this time is going to meet the new group, that is their finance minister, also the coming new governor of the central bank, also the premier Lai I-Chung, and in order to create a channel for the future communication. I think that is the purpose. Yellen said it herself. It was not expected they can have a breakthrough right from the beginning. But we can see that Sullivan, the national security advisor, when he's giving an interview on the plane when they flew to London, he also saying very positive about Yellen's this trip. And he said that President Biden is receiving a daily report coming from Yellen, and he's expecting that Yellen will come back and have a comprehensive report after that. But still, Sullivan is saying that we need to have military dialogue, just like Lai I-Chung had just mentioned. That is the main concern that the U.S. is having with China these days. Right?
And as you mentioned earlier, that this time Yellen actually met a lot of retired officials from China. So we're kind of saying that they want this conversation to prolong. But at the same time, do you think there might also be other dialogues that's being discussed under table that's not seen on media right now?
For instance, some was saying that from China point of view, they are saying that the U.S. is asking that China would still keep on purchasing the Treasury debt, Treasury bonds, right, in order to support the U.S. finance. And there's also kind of expectation that China's hoping they can get into a conversation about dropping the punitive tariff that President Trump had been labeled on Chinese import, but that didn't go anywhere. So I think there's still a lot of issues between China and the United States haven't been resolved yet. But this is a kind of momentum that both China and the U.S. were hoping to begin in the future.
And to follow up on that, especially, we're seeing that first, President also mentioned earlier, Blinken's visit, and then followed by Yellen's visit. So we're probably seeing that the Biden administration is taking a proactive measure to China. And in return, China also emphasized that if trade war were to continue, it will end up in a lose-lose scenarios. Do you think the two superpower nations, they're trying to amend relationship with each other at this point of time?
You know, once two countries agree to have a senior level dialogue, then both sides would need deliverables so they can come out and declare victory for this meeting to secure their previous decision to have a meeting. I think based on the arrangement on the part of Beijing, that Yellen had actually met all the possible counterparts. And Premier Lai I-Chung used to be responsible for economic affairs, not the general secretary of the party. So I would say that personally, I would not look into the fact that whether Yellen had met with Xi Jinping. Secondly, I think this is, as you said, these are the two largest trading nations as well as the two largest economies, and they do have issues to talk about. Among this, general perception of a prolonged strategic competition, this is probably the right moment to cool down a little bit, to reestablish senior dialogue. It's good for both sides.
And the very interesting part is, since the Trump administration, we've been hearing the word decoupling, and then we move on to de-risking. So this time when Yellen actually visited Beijing, she dropped the two terms and she moved on to diversifying. So I feel like we're kind of playing words a little bit here, but do you think there's any special significance behind these words when she mentioned to Beijing?
I think decoupling is cut off, and de-risking for me is a partial decoupling, which means that there are different categories. Maybe there are some sensitive technology, there are some critical issue or items that need to remain. But most manufacturers and most of the normal trade actually was continuing, even with such a strong punitive tariff and other sanctions. But the U.S. China trade figures had continued to rise. So I think it's right. Diversification is definitely better than decoupling, because in this globalized world, especially on trade, no one country can actually conduct a 100% decoupling anyway.
And this is also, we're actually moving on to a bigger question and problem here, and that is we are seeing there is a lot of nice talks going on, but talk is one thing, action is another. Just when Yellen is visiting China, we're seeing also Biden administration is taking action. There's export control of semiconductors, and at the same time, there's continuous of tariffs on Chinese goods.
I think that the Chinese measure before right at the when Yellen visited China and announced those the Germanian as well as Galician, the ban on those definitely is a signal to the United States that China also prepared itself for the possible measure that the United States was about to take. So this is not a sign of the where we have to stop here. Basically, this is a sign that I'm going to do it. Should you want to do and want to proceed with other entity lists or others, and we also know that especially since the year, before the end of last year and also earlier this year, China has several laws and the legislations, particularly aiming at countering the U.S., whether that's trade war or the entity list and all those different things. And this recent announcement, I think, particular time at the Yellen's visit. So this is not a sign of the reconciliation. This is a sign of that China is determined to retaliate should the U.S. wanted to go forward with all those measures that China take as a hostile.
And Chenlung, do you have any take on this?
When Yellen is still in Beijing on Friday, President Biden had an interview with CNN, and within the interview, he said that he wants to talk with Xi Jinping, saying that this is not a warning but an observation, saying that since China is desperately need the Europe and American investment, since China economy have been so bad, China would have to think twice about any of the things that may trigger that kind of blockade on China. I think that is a kind of way of Biden try to balance out. On the one hand, he's sending Yellen to China to have create a dialogue. On the other hand, he is still remain a tough stand on China in order to make that he's having a balanced approach toward China. That would make him good in terms of domestic audience. I think that is something we should be very careful in knowing the whole picture. And plus, China is having this two rare earth metal being blocking from exporting, and also China is still having a sanction on Macron chips,
right?
And also the U.S. is having a similar kind of measure. So the tension is still going on. But coming back, even though the tension or this kind of de-risking measures have been going on, still both sides can try to communicate, just like Yellen has said, with such a huge volume of 600 billion trade between China and the U.S. And that is something that both sides can find plenty of room to do business with.
Right, and then just so we were saying that the tension is still going to be there and it's going to continue. But especially China just carried out and wrote out the espionage law as well. So do you think after Yellen's visit, it will actually alleviate a little bit and probably American firms in Beijing will be less intimidated?
There's also other ministers coming to visit. Raimondo is coming to visit, and also John Kerry is coming to visit.
Right.
John Kerry is coming over on 16th.
Right.
So they're going to say something, mutual cooperation measures, such as they're going to donate a fund for global warming, such as the U.S. is going to commit and also China is going to commit. It will create that kind of general atmosphere for cooperation. That's the expectation also from other countries as well. But still, both sides will keep a very high vigilant about which kind of things that is sensitive to our security. I think that is something that's going to remain.
And Chenlung actually mentioned a very good point, and that is following Blinken's visit, Yellen's visit, and soon we're going to see John Kerry, the climate change convoy, going to China. Do you think this is a whole package from Blinken, Alex?
It's not only from Blinken, it's President Biden's agenda. I think 2023, or before, if I may say, that before the United States getting into a heated presidential primaries. It is in Biden's interest or the entire administration's interest to bring the U.S.-China relations back to a relatively easier or less tense relationship. I think that's pretty important. On the other hand, we all know that the tensions that cause the most focus is the what people call close-in encounter or dangerous encounter of the military platforms in the Western Pacific. Without these building blocks, it is hard to jump to the area, I mean military to military dialogue area so fast. So I think for Biden administration, the strategy is to add the building blocks one by one and create a positive atmosphere. So expecting that at some point that they can address the key issue. Remember that China used to started their dialogue or negotiation with principles, but the United States always wanted to solve the most urgent issue first. I think right now they knew each other for a long time. They just don't want to just being seen as bad at home or being seen by allies and friends that they are weak.
And as we're seeing here, we also mentioned that even though there will be tension going on, but as we see here, the visit overall is very cordial. It's still very friendly. But I would also like to ask, because when Yellen arrived Beijing, a lot of media were criticizing her, especially in the U.S., that she's been bowing down like so many times, and she's probably perceived as overly friendly and is slammed pretty hard by the U.S. So, President, what is your take on this?
I think that just basically reflected about the internal atmosphere and sentiment within the United States about the Biden administration's approach. I think one of the criticism basically is aiming at how the Biden administration seems to take the negotiation for negotiation's sake, or just trying to have a better relationship without having the strategic goal of where this the overall direction and the momentum will go. And so there's no end game in sight about this approach. And of course, the Biden administration responded that what they wanted to do is to have a responsible and manageable competitions with China. And the competition, in order to achieve that, the communication established, that is the most important thing in order to for those competition that can be managed. So I think the criticism and the issue about Yellen basically reflected the two different views in the United States, how they believe what's the best approach toward China.
Chenlung, I see that you're nodding.
I would say that the same thing, just like a mirror image, happened in China. Right. I mean, when Yellen was in the States, there's some saying in China saying that she is the most friendly ministers to China ever among the Biden administration, because she's saying that we should drop the tariff that imposed by the Trump administration, because that would put a lot of pressure on inflation and so on and so forth. So China is putting a lot of propaganda on this. For instance, when she just landed, there's a rainbow on the sky, and then they say that it's just like with her visit that we are going to see rainbow at the end of the China and the U.S. relationship. And they also put up a lot of propaganda on when she's dining in the Yunnan restaurant. It's kind of things that they want to pop up the image that this old lady is going to be friendly to China. We can expect a good result coming from negotiation. But we are seeing that Yellen is still holding the basic principle of the United States. And she's still criticizing China on having more or market opening up, and also on criticizing for doing pressure on the U.S. enterprise. I think that they try to create that kind of propaganda in order to enhance the atmosphere that with Yellen coming to visit, everything will be okay. But on the contrary, that everyone is still on their previous positions.
Right. So the whole atmosphere is being friendly, it's being cordial. But in reality, do you think Yellen has successfully really brought any agreements back to the U.S.?
I don't think so. There's no breakthrough. But in international negotiation, always like that. Once you create a good atmosphere, once you consider that it's reliable, that both sides can build some trust, you can move the negotiation further in the next time. So I think that is still a positive sign.
Alex?
Yeah, some people would say talk is empty or talk is useless. But talk sometimes are good because as I said, it's the building blocks. It changed the atmosphere. You know, eating a spicy Sichuan fish head doesn't mean that you will compromise your position, right? So to meet with your counterpart and talk tough, but still having the meeting is considerably okay. Or otherwise, the situation, the alternative would be even worse.
So we talked about Yellen's visit to Beijing. Overall, we do believe that tension is still going to be there, but at the same time, there is more dialogue, and dialogue is very critical and important. Let's now hear from Alexander Görlach, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. A native of Germany, he's also a just professor at New York University's Gallatin School and the author of Code Red. Our political editor, Rath Rain, spoke to him about German-Chinese ties and implications for the EU, U.S., and Taiwan.
Professor, Chinese Premier Lai I-Chung made Germany his first trip abroad. What do both countries aim to achieve from this?
Well, the premier came for the 7th intergovernmental conversations. And usually this format is actually for very close friends. It's meant for very close friends and dear partners. And there has been much criticism about this format being applied to China, as the German government, as the European Union and many other governments have defined the relationship to China as a competition and not very amicable in some terms. So it was questionable why this format has been continuously applied to the relationship between China and Germany. However, there is a broad consensus in Germany that the German government or Germany as a whole should only de-risk from the Chinese economy and not decouple from the Chinese economy. And the difference is that you continue to do trade, but you would be excluding crucial sectors. Sectors whose products could be used for military use.
Will we see a departure from Angela Merkel's approach of advancing economic ties but being less vocal on China's human rights abuses?
Well, I feel like Angela Merkel has, even though she was pretty much emphasizing on trade with China, always raised the voice regarding human rights. And I feel like in the current coalition in Germany, it's mostly the Green foreign minister and the Liberal Party, the third party in the government, that raise such issues. Olaf Scholz, the chancellor himself, has, in my opinion, I wouldn't call it necessarily ambiguous, but he is not as outspoken as Merkel was. When he visited India, he said that India and Germany shared the same values. This is not true, because the government of Mr. Modi is applying semi-fascist policies, and it's discriminating against 200 million Muslims in India. So nobody forced the German chancellor to say this, but he did. So you can maintain trade ties with countries whose values you do not share. It's just how the world is. But if you call someone like a dear friend or like someone that shares your values, that is another step. And I feel that is actually a difference between Angela Merkel, who would not have done this, and Olaf Scholz is doing it. And he has also gotten much criticism for allowing a Chinese company to take shares of the harbor of Hamburg, which is a strategically important piece of infrastructure in Germany. And he was against all council of people in government and in academia and of Hamburg, the city itself, taking this decision to allow China to do this. So in some regard, Mr. Scholz's attitudes towards China are also a mystery to me.
Speaking of German shared values, how does Chancellor Scholz view democracies such as Taiwan, especially with the U.S.-led effort to support Ukraine Is there a move to strengthen ties here?
In the current government in Germany, like the Justice Minister and the Minister for Research and Science, they both met with their Taiwanese counterparts, the Justice Minister in Berlin and the other minister in Taiwan recently. So there is a will and an understanding that as like-minded countries, as like-minded democracies, we should not be bullied into by China to who we meet and who we don't meet. So I feel there is a clear stance on Taiwan as a friend and as a neighbor and as a friendly neighbor, if you so will. I mean, you're not really our neighbors; it's like far away. But like in that terms of like the distance actually doesn't matter. So the shared values between Taiwan and Germany indeed exist. And in the light of the Ukraine invasion of Russia by Russia of Ukraine, I think the scenario of war has been brought to the attention also of European governments. And I feel in that sense, Taiwan cannot expect too much from Germany militarily because the German army is not fit to stand the test. So in this regard, it's all about the Americans, and US President Biden has stressed a few times that if China would be attacking Taiwan, that the United States would come to assistance and help of Taiwan.
Could deeper ties with Taiwan jeopardize the German-Chinese relationship?
The Chinese government has bullied other governments to fall into the fold that Beijing wants them, if it's Australia or Sweden or Lithuania. I think there is still an understanding in Beijing that they want the goodwill of the Europeans rather than the Americans, because they want to put a trench between the two Western allies, the European Union and the United States. So Germany and other European countries have been a little exempt from the rage, or if you want to call it, by the Chinese leadership when it expressed views that might be contradictory to what Xi Jinping thinks is the truth, like when the German Foreign Ministry Annalena Baerbock went to China. So she spoke pretty much about like the importance of human rights, and I think that's absolutely in order. However, having said that, the reliance of the German car industry, for instance, on the Chinese market, the double-digit growth years in China are over, and for a variety of reasons. One being that China now is much more a dictatorship than it used to be 10 years ago, but also like wages have gone up in China. So to produce in China is not as cheap as it used to be. So that's also kind of a natural development if a country like it gets more successful. So like there is like what we thought about the importance of the Chinese market for Germany. What was true like 10 or 15 years ago, that's not still the same case. So there has to be a reassessment regardless the political developments in China.
Will Germany eventually be forced to pick sides, given Europe's long stance of neutrality and independence from US actions?
Germany always tries to do something which is called the German Sonderweg, the special way. And that was applied also in times of the Cold War, just say like, because there is a certain affinity or proximity in terms of geography to Russia. So Germany wanted to not be like entirely swallowed by the United States. But I feel in the current global climate, and also especially in with the war in Ukraine, I think the European countries have been pretty much aligned to their alliance with the United States, the Western alliance, the military alliance, NATO. So I feel like if Europe can choose, it would not embark on military endeavors. But there's also clear that if a war would break out, it's not the choosing of the German people or the American people. It would be the choosing of Xi Jinping. And that is something where then the allies of Taiwan have to react accordingly. So I feel if you look at the map now, I'd say like Europe and the United States, or Europe and or NATO as a whole, is pretty much on one side together. And even though you have countries like Hungary who try like to be a little more open to Russia at this point, it's still like they also stand with their allies. So I feel if there was a conflict breaking out over Taiwan, you would not see a European nation like taking side with China.
How concerned is Germany on the economic impact of Chinese military action on Taiwan?
Even though there might be like plans in Germany and in Arizona in the United States, I feel that is just to somehow have global supply chains not too much being under pressure if something would be happening. But like the Taiwan Strait has, I think, 70% of the world's container ships going through. It's not only like one plant or another plant, there's also the whole ecosystem that supports the production of chips on Taiwan. So I feel like if there were a war, it would totally affect global supply chains, and that is in no one's interest. And so I feel that is pretty much on the forefront of policymakers everywhere in the world.
As the United States and China compete for global dominance, both sides have been proactively soliciting global allies. Currently, Beijing seems to be focusing its efforts on two key main areas, the global south and Europe. While notable shifts have transpired in the relationships between Europe, Taiwan, and China. So, President, as we see that Minister Wu visited Europe in mid-June, what do you think was the motive behind this?
I believe that when during the U.S. China competitions, China look at the two areas, global south as the area that they already have significant influence, and that is where the diplomatic support China wanted to have, they might be able to get. But the Europe is where the true money that really lies. That is whether the economic loss due to the competition vis-a-vis the United States, China wanted to have it back through its relationship with Europe. And also, what China want to avoid it is actually the U.S., Europe, and were together a ban on China. And so the Chinese relationship with Europe, especially from years as late of the year 2020, as well as things moving forward, is always tough on the United States, but would like to seek ameliorate relationship with the Europe, whether that's the CAI or other kind of agreement. And of course, since year 2021, the ban and also the kind of sanction China put on the European scholars and the parliamentary members that really soured the relationship, China's relationship with Europe. But still, China looks at the Europe as the area that they need the Europe at least. Although probably Europe will not be on Chinese side, but they want Europe not to be on the U.S. side in its competitions.
Okay, so but we're also seeing that primarily also visited Germany and France around pretty much the same time. So what do you think are the dynamics right now for China-Europe and Taiwan-Europe relationship?
If you, from a Beijing point of view, now it's that the European country is somehow needed China in order to strengthen their economic relationship, and also a lot of countries are hoping by opening up the Chinese market, they can revive their economy. And that is quite an important thing. The other thing is they are relying on whether China can be an honest broker in the Ukraine war. If not an honest broker, at least China can refrain itself from supporting militarily to Russia. I think that is another concern of Europe. But vice versa, we can also see that in the coming Lithuanian NATO summit, there's 4 Asian countries. It's called Asian Pacific 4, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. They are attending the summit. I mean, they haven't been a part of the NATO yet, but they are coordinating with NATO, and that is the thing that worries China a lot. That is a sign, seems that NATO is going to expand it into Asia Pacific areas. So you can see that there's a tug of war going on now in Europe between the U.S. and China.
And as we're seeing that Minister Wu visited Prague and Czech Republic, so do you think the relationship between Europe and Taiwan would probably have a closer tie, especially right after, like the Russian-Ukrainian war, the incident happened? Do you think Europe will actually shift to Taiwan a little bit more? Alex?
I think it's not a zero-sum competition. The European countries' support of Taiwan are based on values, based on democracy, and based on what they believe. Although most of the engagement or interaction were between parliamentarians, but I think Europe has been in history that very much looking into values or putting values as part of their foreign policies.
Right.
I do not think that the interest, strategic interest, business interest will override everything or change the tide. So for me, they can do it at the same time. I do not believe that that Europe will forget their economic interest in the Chinese market on one hand, but they will not forget the democratic and value linkage with Taiwan.
I am going to read a really quick excerpt from the president and CEO of Belgium's Inter-University Microelectronics Center. So initially, he said he hopes that any potential investment by TSMC in the European chip sector would allow the two sides to further bolster their research and development R&D partnerships, particularly as Taiwan leads the world in manufacturing and Europe excels at R&D and innovation. So Chenlung, do you think that from now, especially Europe right now, they will probably, when it comes to semiconductor, they were probably more focused on Taiwan and probably even promote a closer China relationship and also more opportunity for Taiwan and European markets?
Already there's a preliminary exploration whether TSMC can set up a manufacturing facility in Germany.
Right.
And that is something that have been looking forward by European Union. But also we are seeing there's a huge investment of electric car battery plant in France that can create 12,000 jobs. And even President Macron was there to having a groundbreaking ceremony. And I think that is the strength of Taiwan industry. We are not only focused on TSMC, there's other sector as well for Taiwan to develop.
And so, President, do you think that, like what Chenlung said earlier, whether it's for the EV batteries or for semiconductors, if there's a closer tie between Taiwan and Europe, do you think China will retaliate? What do you think the China's concerns will be, and how do you think China will react to it?
How China can retaliate against TSMC? China needs TSMC more than anything else, so that I do not think that China would dare to retaliate in this regard. And also, I would just add some words about the political relations between Taiwan and Europe. While the Joseph Wu, our foreign minister, visited Prague, I was there and witnessed the whole thing. So it is not just about his physical visit, not just meeting with the parliamentary member, but also he was at the same frame with the Czech president at that time. And of course, the Czech still at that time make it very careful that avoided direct handshake between those two. But they're so close enough, the eye contact and make the picture to lay out the political message without hiding anything. So that is the one of the groundbreaking event I saw, especially from our foreign minister to have a physical presence in one of the European countries, and not just about Czech, but also the Joseph Wu, he visits Poland, the Brussels, and even a surprise visit to Italy. So those are also all unprecedented. So the issue is that Europe right now is not just no longer dominated by both France and Germany. So that France, Germany want to dominate and to lead up the European China policy. It does not seem to be the momentum right now. And although those two countries still will a significant influence in the overall outcome of the EU policy toward China. But right now, the Central and Eastern Europe, due to the war in Ukraine, their political weight started to gain significantly in the EU and also the whole Europe, political decisions in the foreign policy. And that's where the Taiwan's, the opening to Taiwan has started to, with those places, especially some of those places, their economic exposure to China is not as heavy, and also their understanding about the democratic value due to their common history of being dominated by the Soviet Union, also made them more resonate with what Taiwan experienced. And that basically tells the recent opening of the Taiwan with the Central Eastern Europe the relationship, and this will continue. And those things happened without the fanfare of the TSMC visit to the and the investment in Germany, and also the Brussels, the big statement about welcoming Taiwan's high-tech visit. So that means that the overall contour of Taiwan relationship with Europe, right now, we do see that there are multiple centers, multiple actors, multiple forces. So it is not just going to be a one-end event. And I do see the momentum is going to get stronger as time goes by.
As you mentioned earlier, that there were some Eastern Europe countries that their economic exposure to China probably not as heavy. So if that's the case, do you think that also means more opportunity for Taiwan?
And that means that they are more daring to try new things rather than they follow the old norm about not offending China. And also another important momentum is that the Europe commercial department or the Europe economic side of the society right now look at China more as a risk. So that's how the de-risking itself has been coming out, especially from the Van der Leyen, the European Union commissioners, and the Europe investment in China and taking the Chinese market. The importance is no longer as it was in the past. So that we do see the kind of the paradigm shift in terms of economic and also the financial thinking among the European leadership.
So aside from semiconductor and also aside from the EV batteries that we just talked about, and you were there in Europe, do you think there's any other important, significant of Taiwan to, or things that's significant and manufactured in Taiwan that's very important to Europe?
I have to say that Taiwan, we have a lot of the invisible champion. And so that like the battery investment in France, I have to say that before the big announcement coming out, probably not a lot of people in Taiwan, they do notice that we have the world-class battery manufacturers within Taiwan. And so it also applies to us other cases, such as our cooperation with Lithuania, and also possibly with some other new investment in Czechia. So I'm not going to name the companies for the sake of having their operation to be as smooth as possible. But I wanted to say that we are. It seems that Taiwan is much stronger than it appears to be, and some European countries recognize that.
And we should be expecting that we should have more dialogues with Europe as well. But if we want to move back to China and the U.S., it seems like U.S. and China are both worried about Europe's relationship with either of them. So how important, of course, we've been talking about importance of Europe to China, to Taiwan. Now, Alex, the importance of Europe to the U.S.?
Well, Europe as a whole, having its own strategic initiative, their own momentum, and somewhat independent foreign policy probably will be welcomed by European countries as a whole. Of course, being a spot to be competed by both Beijing and Washington may give Europe a kind of edge to deal with those. But there are still differences. I think Europe may look into the cooperation with some kind of shared leadership. European countries' relationship with China is not a competition of leadership. It's enlarged their possibility of cooperation. So the nature or essence, I believe, are different. The real challenge for both Washington and Beijing is that whether they can exercise their power and skill to convince the Europeans that which one is much better, closer, and near dear to the European values and their interests.
And Chenlung, your take on this?
I think when we see the European, we have to remind ourselves that they have their own strategic autonomy that is different from Washington's own interests. And we like to have Taiwan's basic value to corresponding to theirs, but somehow we have to make the distinction that they think differently with the United States, and that is the concern we should have, right?
You mean Europe think differently from the U.S.?
Right.
Okay.
They have their own interests, and also within Europe, as Yi-Chung had just mentioned, the Central and Eastern Europe is different from Western Europe. And in terms of how to end the war in Ukraine and how is their economic competition with the United States, they are all different.
Do you think Europe will continuously stay its neutrality and an economic partnership with China?
They realize that if they want to be influential and powerful, they have to unite it together. So they have to compromise on their differences. I think Europeans have been constantly doing the adjustment and constantly doing try to reach a consensus among themselves. And that would make Europe different from the Washington approach to Beijing, right?
So while the U.S. and China, they're currently redefining geopolitics, after all these discussions we have, do you think that Europe is actually in a win-win scenario after all?
Or lose-lose scenario.
Why would you say that? Yes.
I mean, now the Europeans still rely heavily on the U.S. Security. And also they are not strong enough in terms of economic competition like China. So how do you find your own niche within the competition without being become a loser in the whole global scenario? I think that is the thing that Europeans have been thinking very hard. And they are all divided. I mean, it would be very hard to put them all together and heading into the same direction.
A consensus.
Right.
And President, your view on this?
I think that we had to avoid that taking the glasses of the U.S.-China competition to see everything, and especially about what we expect from the Europe. The Europe, although they are not in a competition mode with China, but they do value the political values are very important. And many of the differences between Europe and China, and also the tension between Europe and China, actually came from this, came from the value factors, not about the who is going to dominate the whole world and who is going to win the United States. And I think so that is of a very different layer. And the lenses for us to look at the Europe-China relation and also Europe-U.S. relation. And that's why also the Europe is now opening to Taiwan. That also addressed some of the relative weight differences between Taiwan and China in the eyes of the Europe.
And Alex, any last comment on this? Is Europe in a win-win scenario?
Consolidating alliance between Europe and the United States is one thing. Expanding partnership between China and Europe is another one. It could be win-win, but as Chenlung has said, that you must have a consensus for the entire union. That's very difficult because countries' interests do conflict at some point.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you all next time.